First up, let's look at the ranges. So in positions range, when the button has 30 big blinds and the big blind has 40, so when the button is covered by both the blinds, his opening range is supposed to look like this. So there will be some limps. That's why you can see these kind of hands like low-state aces, middling suited stuff grayed out. Those are just supposed to be limping a lot. But still, the majority of our range wants to be raising. So this is in positions range when the button is covered. And this is in positions range, so buttons range, when he's covering. We can see when the button is covering the big blind, there is almost no limping, very, very low frequency. That's why, again, some mixes like Jack-9 is raising 80% of the time and limping 20% of the time. Very small and marginal, but as I said, I wanted to let the ranges intact for this scenario. So yeah, buttons range, of course, way tighter when covered. And then for the big blinds range, this is the big blind range when the big blind is covering, and this is the big blinds range when the big blind is covered. So we can see that even though the buttons range is significantly wider when the button is covering, the big blind has to defend a lot tighter. When the big blind is covering, we can see even 10 deuce off is a defend like 9-3 off, 9-4 off, basically defending an extremely wide range. Whereas when the big blind doesn't have the benefit of the bounty, can claim in position bounty, then we can see defending range closer to like normal non-PSK or GPV ranges. Okay, and with that, how do we adjust Postflop? So we will jump into the sheet again, of course, a different tab where we have the same kind of layout. First thing we want to look at is the leading frequencies when the button covers. So when the big blind has 30 big blind and the button has 45, and we can actually see there is pretty much zero leading. Now, when it's the big blind that's covering, we do see a little bit of leading, but it's not significant. The biggest frequency leaderboard is 865 Rainbow, where we see like 31% leading, and almost all of the other boards are similar kind, like very low and connected or low paired, and the leading frequency is still fairly low. So it's not something we should worry about too much. And we can also see that there's just not much leading, even in a spot where the ranges are wide. And the main reason for that is just going to be that the buttons range is fairly tight here when he's covered, and the big blinds range is super wide when he's covering. So because of that, there's just no leading. Now, on to the strategies for in position. And overall, we can see that again, we have a reduced checking frequency. Overall, all across these boards, we would be checking 22% when we are covered as the button. But when we are covering, then we are checking back only 14.7, so like 15%. As for sizings, we have something interesting here. So we actually end up using less big sizings in this scenario. And the reason for that is that there is simply a very large range difference between how wide the button opens and how wide the button defends, the big blind defends, when the stacks are changed. So when the button is covering, he gets to open much wider, and the big blind gets to defend regularly, whereas when the opposite is true, the button gets to open fairly tight, and the big blind, as we saw, defend like 9-3 offsuit. Now, more specifically, onto ace-high boards, we can see that pretty much all of them are going to be range bets regardless of who covers whom, with maybe the exception of ace-6-6, which is some very low check frequency. We see the half pot sizing used a lot because, again, the big blind will not be defending much ace-x. However, one thing that we notice very clearly is the reduction and the difference in the big sizings. For example, a board like, say, ace-9-3, we can see that when the button is covered, so when the big blind is covering, the small sizing is almost never there, and the button just range bets for half pot and some larger pot sizing bets. Whereas when the button is the one covering, we can see small sizing very prevalent, and the pot sizing used almost half as much. The reason for that, again, has to do with the ranges. So if we examine these two boards, again, on the left side, we have the big blind covering, and on the right side, we have the button covering. So when the big blind is covering, we can actually see the buttons using larger sizings, significantly more often than when the button is covering. And this just has to do, as I said, with the equity. So if we look at the equity for in position in the two scenarios, when the button is covered and he opens tight, he has 67% equity, whereas when the button is covering and opens wider, he has 63.8%. So there is an over 5% difference in the equity advantage between the two ranges. So this is what leads us to betting larger more often and just spotting even ace-9-3 rainbow when we are covered because of how tight our range is. If we look at the response against spot, we can see roughly what we would expect, where the calling range is about the same. The big blind is folding slightly less when he's covering, just calls a bit of a higher frequency, some bottom pair, like some Jack 3 off is calling a bit more, for example. But yeah, it's almost the same ranges. Against the small sizing, similar kind of concept where when the big blind is covering, he folds a bit less and he raises a bit more and just doesn't slow play as much. We can see the main hands added to the check raising range are going to be some suited backdoor, straight backdoor, flush draw kind of hands around this area. Because again, being able to make the backdoor nuts is very valuable when we cover in the PSKO. And that's why we've seen most of the added hands come from this category. One thing to check out here would also be what the bottom value bet is. So let's put a brick on the turn, like the 8 of hearts, I guess, is as brick as they get. The barreling in both cases is fairly high, but the button again gets to barrel more when he is covered because his range is much tighter and the big blind continues wider on the flop. The button actually gets to bet more when he's covered than the other way around. And again, if we look at the equity on the turn, we can see that the button has way more equity when he's covered because of the big blind continuing more on the flop and him opening a much stronger range pre-flop. The most common sizing appears to be this 70% one. So let's see here. Calling range against that. Yep, they seem fairly reasonable. Now we have the big blind folding a bit more when he's covering, because on a complete brick, all of the extra hands he called on the flop, like these suit or even raise some of these kind of set hands we can see now have to fold, and these are just a bit of a higher frequency. And after the call, if the river is another brick, like I guess a deuce seems bricky enough, like say deuce of hearts. Let's see what the bottom value jam is here. So it appears any ace can basically jam, and then also some of these like tens hands, I guess, are also jamming in both cases. So yeah, it's very, very close, the jamming ranges. Like we don't jam anything too crazy for value. But it is important to jam these non-ace highs for value on the river because the big blind just has to call a bunch of 9x. Obviously, when we're up against an ace, well, too bad. But he needs to call a lot of non-ace-x hands. So value betting this kind of pocket pairs is fairly significant. But yeah, I can see that the post-flop differences aren't too huge. The main alteration in strategies come from the flop C betting, where they're just pretty much no checking when the button is covering. But also we see less big sizings because on these ace high boards, the button's range is just going to be weaker when he's covering. Then we have the king high boards, where the strategies again look fairly identical. So because of the huge difference in the button's range and how much wider it is, we can see that he doesn't really get to range bet king high boards, where the checking frequency is still the same pretty much, whether the button is covering or the big blind is covering. This effect is way bigger here because this stack size difference affects the opening range a lot more. In the previous scenario where it was hijack against big blind, whether the big blind was covering the hijack or not, because of how many people the hijack had behind, didn't really affect the opening range all that much. And also I just used the same opening range to begin with. But even if I didn't, the range wouldn't be that affected. Now, because the big blind is one out of the two players behind, when the button is covered or covering the big blind, this really affects the button's range. So when it is so much wider, the negative risk premium and the bounty aspect doesn't allow him to put that much more money in. So yeah, we can see all the king high boards are pretty much same strategy, almost identical frequencies in the sizings and in the checks, very small differences. Then we have queen highs, which again seem very, very close. We can see the button still cannot really range bet, even if he's covering. Checks like slightly less, but still very, very close in frequencies. Jack highs will be very similar as well. Again, it's slightly less checking, with the main difference being on something like Jack 8 or Jack 8-8, where when the big blind is covering, the button has to check back like 45%. But when the button is covering, he gets to pretty much range bet. And we can have a look here. So we have Jack 8-8 and Jack 8-8. First, in terms of the equity, we can see that, again, when the button is covered, his equity is significantly larger because of the strength of his range. But the bet frequency here goes down, and that's because of the nut disadvantage that the button has and how much pressure the big blind can apply. We can see the big blind is raising significantly more when he's covering here. Like, it's way more. So it's 5% more, and we also have to consider that the button is betting a way stronger and tighter range. So on these kind of paired boards where the big blind has a massive nut advantage, then the button has to be very careful with the betting frequencies when he's covered. The main hands added will again be the backdrop fluster hands. Like we can see this kind of King of Spades 5 or King of Spades 4 are at a higher frequency when the big blind is covering. Then also something like Queen 5 of diamonds with the backdrop fluster is a pure frequency continue when the big blind is covering, but pretty much a pure fold when the button is covering. So I would say this is the main type of board where we see much more c-betting from the button when the button is covering. It's this kind of boards where the big blind has an advantage. And it's mostly that the button just has to check back a lot when he's covered. On 10 high boards, here we are. So here, the bet frequencies are again increased a little bit, but still button has to do a bunch of checking. And we also see some more large sizings, but again, the difference isn't very large. The most different board appears to be 10-6-4, where the check frequency drops from 42 down to 24. So we have 10-6-4 and 10-6-4. Right, so we can see that when the button is covered, there is more big sizings and a lot of checking. So a fairly strong polar-ish kind of betting range split between half pot and pot. Whereas when the button is covering, then we see a much higher bet frequency, but also a bigger concentration of smaller sizings. Again, the equity advantage is larger when the button is covered, but the big blind has to fold a little bit more, as we can see, against the small sizing when the big blind is covered by the button. The response against pot looks like this, so will be fairly similar in terms of folding. Slightly less folding when the big blind is covering, but a bit more value jamming when the big blind is covered, because the button just has to call very wide with like ace king off and these kind of hands. Then finally, we have the low card boards, and this is where we see the biggest difference. So we see a lot of these boards were supposed to be very high check back frequency when the button was covered, but when the button is covering, this is just going to be range bets. So boards that stand out the most here would be something like 9-3 deuce and then 3-3 deuce. So let's look at those two. We have 9-3 deuce and 9-3 deuce, where we can see that when the button was covered, he has to check over 37% of the time, whereas when the button is covering, it's just going to be a pure range bet. If we look at the equities, they're closer now, but again, the button has a bigger equity advantage when he is the covered stack because of how tight he opens. Against the small sizing bet, this is the response. So we can see that the big blind just has to fold quite a bit less when he's covering. The check raising drops a little bit too because of the stronger range. But again, a lot of the suited backdoor fluster hands want to continue more when the big blind is covering the button. And this is why the button just cannot be range betting these boards when he's covered, or else the big blind check raise frequency would have to punish him a bit too much. Then we also had 3-3 deuce. Where we see kind of the same principle. So equity-wise, again, the button has slightly more equity when he is the covered stack, but because of the big blind nut advantage, the button cannot c-bet much when he's covered. And we can see that when the button is covered, even though he c-bets only like 43-44% of the time for the small sizing, the big blind gets to check raise 33%. Whereas when the button is range betting as the covering stack, the big blind can only check raise 25%. And this is where this difference lies, that all of these suited backdoor hands, and even like queen 5 off, like you can see this queen 6 off, this kind of two high, or well, one high card, one middling card with a backdoor straight draw, are very, very common check raises when the big blind is covering. So you can imagine if the button was range betting, how much the big blind would have to check raise here. So we can see the same thing that I mentioned earlier on Jack 8-8, where on these boards where the big blind has the nut advantage, the button, when he's covered, he has to be very, very careful, because the big blind can just check raise super wide with a very large variety of hands. We can see a lot of these Jack 8, Jack 7 are pure raises with the backdoor flush draw when the big blind is covering the button. Response against check raise looks like this, where when the button is covered, he wants to do a bunch of jamming with the vulnerable pocket pairs, or not jamming, I guess clicking, but probably not going to be folding to a jam with any of those. And the reason is that we just get it in against the deuce very, very often, whereas, and even like some open-ended straight was like the 5-4 kind of hand. Whereas when it's the other way around, because the button has a very, very wide c-bet range, just a pure range bet, in order for the button to be able to continue with all of the suited kind of backdoor flush draw hands, he just doesn't get to have any 3-bets on the flop. And we can see the difference in terms of continuing against the check raise is fairly significant too. When the, we can see, yeah, but when the button is covering, he falls only 24% of the check raise, even though it's a much tighter check raise than when the big blind is covering. But when the button is covered, even against the wide check raise, he has to fall 34%. So we can see a hand like, say, queen 10 off or queen jack off is always folding when the big blind is covering the button. The button just bet fold this hand. But when the button is covering, he just bet calls it. And because the button wants to continue all of these hands, he just doesn't end up developing a 3-betting range on the flop. This is another cool concept of this post-flop PSKO stuff, where when the covering thug is incentivized to continue a lot with high cards and backdoor straights or backdoor flush draws, he often doesn't get to 3-bet the flop against the check raise, so that he can protect this wide hand that he wants to be calling. And we can see the main difference in the continuing comes from this offsuit department. But even on the other kind of low boards, we can overall see that the check back frequency is greatly reduced. Even on these more middling like 9-5-3 ones, we can see the button was supposed to be checking 50% when covered, but now ends up checking only 23.7% when covering. Okay, and with that, we can move on to the last example, which is under the gun opens, and then the button calls. So under the gun opens and button calls. And for this, I have two scenarios, one where under the gun has 80 big blinds and button has 20. And then the opposite, where under the gun has 20, but the button has 80. And I think this is the most interesting example of this chapter. First, let's have a look at the ranges. On the left side, we have the under the gun player having 80 big blinds, the button having 20. And on the right side, we have under the gun having 20 and button having 80. So first, under the gun's range, as we can expect, when the under the gun player has 80 big blinds and he covers the entire table, he gets to open a very, very wide range, over 24%, close to 25%. On the contrary, when under the gun has only 20 big blinds and he's covered by the entire table and his bounty is worth around 13 big blinds, as we said, then he has to open a very, very tight range, as we can see, barely 10%. As for the button's range, when the button is covered by under the gun and only has 20 big blinds, he gets to go like this. So not too tight of a range. We can see hands like queen jack off, king 10 off, ace 9 off calling against under the gun. The reason of his hands call is that under the gun's range is just so wide. So it's sort of like a hijack kind of range. And also the big blind is a bit protected from squeezes because the opener covers both of the blinds. The button's range now, when under the gun opens of 20 big blinds, looks like this. So even though the under the gun range is super tight, the button still gets to call about 26% of hands. We can see very wide on suited hands, not so much on the offsuit ones, but going down to queen 4 suited and 8-5 suited, 9-6 suited, 7-4, 4-3, and so on. Okay, so with that, we can jump into the document. Let me go to the correct slide. And so let me filter by board texture and we can start the same, right? So first, we have out of position c-bet, and this is what we want to focus on first. On the left side, we have under the guns c-bet when he's the big stack, 8 big blinds. And then here we have under the guns c-bet when he only has 20 big blinds. And overall, we can see that even though the under the guns range is significantly stronger, when he has 20 big blinds, he actually gets to c-bet quite a bit less. The c-betting is way more when under the gun covers at the bottom. Starting from ace-high boards, these are going to be fairly high c-bet frequencies, but we do have a very interesting dynamic here. The button, the under gun player, actually gets to bet a higher frequency on these ace-high boards when he's the short stack, because his opening range is very, very high card heavy. These ace-high boards are super good for him. In addition, the button's calling range is very, as we saw, like suited, connected, heavy. So we can see under the gun actually gets to range bet every single ace-high board when he opens off 20 and the button calls off 80. Whereas the button does, the under the gun player, when he's covered, does end up having to check some of the more connected ones, like ace king 3, ace queen 5, this kind of locked Broadway heavy tech ones, even ace jack 10. Then something that we also see is that when under the gun only has 20 big blinds, he uses more bigger sizings across pretty much all of these ace-high boards, or most of these anyway. For example, a board like ace-jack-7, we can see is going to be like a half-pot range bet, whereas a board like ace-jack-10, we can see the pot sizing just being used a lot. Same goes for ace-king-3. So with that, let's have a look at a board like ace-king-3. Left side, of course, is button being the short stack, and right side is button being the big stack. So when under the gun opens off 80 big blinds, we can see that this board is just not very good for him. There are so many suited connected hands that have completely bricked. Out of position's equity here is 50%, so it doesn't even have an equity advantage on ace king 3. On the contrary, when under the gun opens off 20 big blinds, he's all over this board. There are basically almost no misses, only these 8, 7, 6s pocket pairs. Everything else has at least something. And we can see the equity from under the gun when he opens off 20 big blinds and the button calls off 80 is 68.6%. So it goes from 50 to 68. And because of this huge difference in equity, we see the c-bet frequency go up so much, even though under the gun is covered. One thing we also see is that we start having a bunch of small sizings, and that's because of the amount of auto folds in the button's range. We can see that when under the gun has 20 big blinds and bet small, the button still has to fold about a third of his range against his very small sizing c-bet. Against the larger sizing, like for example, let's look against the half pot, which is the most commonly used one, and examine the responses. We can see that again, the button has to fold about 42% of his range when he is covering because of just how much garbage he has. All these like suited stuff that have completely bricked without the flush draw, the pocket pairs. Whereas the button, when he is the short stack, he can continue with about 70%, like 69% of his range, 69. Because the range is just way more condensed and has connected a lot more with this board. Again, this is a very serious and important concept to understand. But even though the button is covering in this scenario, because of how tight under the gun opens, he just doesn't care. Just has a huge equity advantage. King-high boards, on the other hand, work a bit differently. So if we have a look here, we can see that actually under the gun gets to c-bet more king-high boards when he is the bigger stack. We also see more large sizings being used. For example, a board like king 9-7 is close to a range bet for under the gun when he opens off 80 big blinds, but is a 61% check frequency when under the gun has 20. And let's see why that happens. So first, let's look at the equity. And we can see that the equity advantage is still higher when under the gun has 20, but the difference is now much smaller. The equities are way closer. Because the king-high board connects fairly well with the under the gun's range of 80 big blinds because of all the suited kings and like king 10 off, king jack off in that range. Also, the 9-7 again connects with the suited connected part. Whereas under the gun at 20 big blinds has all these ace 10 off, ace jack off, which are a fairly large portion of the opening range and just complete misses here. Same goes like 6s and 8s. So we see a lot of small sizing c-betting for under the gun when he has 80 big blinds. And that is just target the suited aces and some low pocket pairs. Against the half pot sizing, the response is like this. So not much folding for in position regardless. when the button has 20 big blinds, again, the main folded hands are low suited aces and pocket pairs. Whereas when the button has 80 big blinds and is covering, it's again going to be some of these low suited hands, low suited aces, indifferent, low suited queens, hands like that. So yeah, fairly close responses. Again, the main difference comes from c-betting on the flop. And yeah, the same is true for these other ones. On the very connected ones, like King 10-9, for example, under the gun has to do a lot of checking in both cases. King 10-9, like King Queen Deuce, these lopped high card, heavy textures, under the gun has to check regardless of the stack sizes. Next, we have Queen High boards. And on these ones, the betting frequencies look fairly similar. We can see under the gun is doing a bit more betting when he is the big stack, especially on the more middling ones, like say some Queen 9-8, Queen 7-6, because as we said, he has these middling suited connected hands that interact with these kind of board textures. In terms of sizings, we don't see any super significant differences. We can see they're fairly close, like a lot of small sizing along with some half potting. Overall, under the gun does get to use more half pot when he's covering, especially on these dry-ish boards like Queen 4 Deuce kind of texture, which, by the way, is a range bet in both situations. Then we have these Jack High textures, where again, they look fairly close, the strategies between each other, but the under the gun player gets to do a bit more betting when he is covering and also use a bit more half pot sizings. Like, for example, Jack 8-8, even though it is a range bet in both cases, under the gun gets to range bet for half pot when he's covering and pretty much use the small sizing, or well, use it a lot more when he is covered. 10 high boards are fairly similar as before, where again, we see a lot more betting from under the gun because of these low connected boards like 10-7-5. Under the gun has to check 47% and only bet this like half pot and pot sizing when he's covered, but he can range bet half pot when he's covering on this like 10-7-6 kind of board. Let's have a look at this one. So 10-7-6 and 10-7-6. So yeah, right side, when under the gun has 20, just has to check a lot because of all the high cards that have missed. When under the gun has 80, he has all of those like 7-5 suited, 8-6 suited, like all these kind of hands have some connection, have at least a pair. So if we look at the equity, we can see that now they are very close to being the same, but under the gun just has a lot more connection when he has 80 big blinds. And against the half pot bet, which is pretty much the main sizing here, this is the response. So we can see button gets to fold like 35% when he has 20 big blinds, because these high cards and low suited aces just have to fold. Whereas when the button has 80 big blinds and covers under the gun, he gets to continue with a lot of these like suited hands and just has a lot more pairs in his range. It's like all this area of the deck just really, really good for the button, just when he has a big stack and he can call these suited connected hands. Let's have a look at a second barrel as well. So if the turn is a complete brick, the frequencies look fairly close. Again, under the gun is betting a bit more when he has the bigger stack. And turn strategy looks like this. So yeah, I think seems reasonable. Again, main difference comes from the actual flop c-bet strategies. And then we have the most interesting board category, which is the low card boards. And the reason I'm saying this is the most interesting is because we have the biggest differences in how we get to play. For example, a board like 9-8-3 is a range check almost when under the gun has 20 big blinds and button has 80, but it is almost a range bet when under the gun has 80. And again, this comes down to the range construction, all those suited middling connected hands. The other very, very interesting thing that we see is under the gun having c-bet jams on these low boards when he has the big stack size. And this happens on a board like 5-4-4, for example, or even 7-7-6. So let's have a look. So we have 5-4-4. Right, and in terms of equity for under the gun, we can see that they're very close. And under the gun gets to range bet in both cases, but gets to jam about half his range when he has 80 big blinds. Against the jam, this is what button has to call. So calling ace-10, calling ace-9 with a spade, and then flush draws and pairs, basically. So what hands we get to jam? Well, this will be, of course, the most vulnerable pocket pairs. Will be value jam with our ace highs, like ace-queen, ace-jack, just value jam. And then we also see some high cards with a spade, like king-jack. Well, king-jack actually jamming even without a spade, but king-queen way more likely to jam with the spade. And then also a lot of king highs that we can see jam. The reason these king highs want to be jamming is that they end up folding out a bunch of these ace-x, not to have a frequency, but still folding a bunch of these ace-x, and we fold out king queen. So that jamming king jack here, king jack is actually doing fine against the calling range. If we think about it, our opponent can call a pair, which if we have king jack with a spade, we're doing pretty well against that, or some like ace high, which unless it's the flush draw, we are doing fine. So yeah, this kind of hands just benefit a lot from jamming. We can see suited kings being the main ones, and then some more natural ones like 7-5 with the 6-5, like these vulnerable pairs. When under the gun is covered and only has 20 big blinds, then we see no jamming and mostly use the small sizing. This is the response against the small sizing. When the button covers, just doesn't really fold anything, like anything with the backdoor flush draw is basically calling. Even 10-9 off with a spade is calling. Whereas when the button has 20 big blinds, again, it's not folding much, but folds a little bit more. The same is true for a board like 7-7-6. It's close to range, but even when the button is the big stack and under the gun is covered. But when under the gun is the big stack, we see a lot of jamming, like over 65%. And it's ace highs, king highs, pocket pairs, like middling, suited, connected stuff, just a lot of jamming. And in position's response is very similar, calling like good ace-x and then flush draws and pocket pairs. Other boards we have jamming on would be something like 8-7-4 as well, which I guess is a very fun one to look at. We have 8-7-4 and we have 8-7-4. So this board goes from being a range check when under the gun has 20 big blinds to being a range bet when under the gun has 80. And this just comes from the equity. We can see under the gun has a lot more equity here when he has 80 big blinds because of all the connected suited stuff that he opens. Whereas when under the gun has 20, all of the high cards have completely bricked out here. So again, a very, very big difference. Then we also see some jumps, and these are going to be with the vulnerable 8x and 7x, because these hands just need value, like pocket knights as well. And for bluffs, we are going to be using some ace high, some king jack again, especially with the spade. Some straight draws, so same kind of thought process. Okay, and then for in-position strategy, which we can see here, in-position doesn't have any jumps, regardless of if he's covering or not. And the stabbing frequency looks fairly close. So the button gets to stab a little bit more when he's covering. But yeah, as I said, the difference is just not that high. Let's try to spot the boards with the biggest difference. And these are just going to be the low card boards. On this kind of, like say, 9 reduce 8-7-4 and so on, we can see that the button is doing a lot more stabbing when he's the bigger stack. Like the check frequency is just significantly lower, and we also see a lot of half pot sizing. So it follows the same thought process that under the gun, when he has 80 big blinds, has just completely, 20 big blinds has just completely missed on the low card boards, so in position gets to stab a lot. Otherwise, in position strategy is going to look fairly close to what we would expect to see in this spot. So if we take a board like, say, King 6-3, or I guess let's try to find a board where there is significant checking, regardless of who covers whom. So maybe something like Queen 10-9. That looks like a decent board to examine. So Queen 10-9 and Queen 10-9. So reasonably high betting frequency, very close to exact, I would say, regardless of who covers whom. And when under the gun checks, then this is the stabbing frequency. And we can see it looks fairly close. When the button has the bigger stack, he gets to bet a bit less, but also gets to use a bit more of a larger sizing. And the reason is that when the button calls off 80 big blinds, his range is much wider, so he wants to develop a more polar betting range because of how many complete garbage he has that can't afford to bet. Whereas when the button has 20 big blinds, his range is very condensed, so he just bets a very high frequency for a small sizing. The response against the small sizing stab looks like this. So a lot of calling, not too much raising. Under the gun has to check fold a lot when he has 80 big blinds, even though he covers, he just has a bunch of complete garbage. Whereas when under the gun has 20 big blinds, he has almost no misses, only like these few suited aces and sixes kind of combos. Okay, so I think from all this PSKO postflop stuff, what we should try to keep is that the main differences come from the flop, like c-betting basically, and calling against c-bet. And the remaining strategies look very similar between the two situations. Then on the flop, the bigger stack doesn't necessarily always get to do more betting. It depends on how tight or wide the opening range is. We saw in this under the gun versus button, which was one of the more, I guess, polar examples in the sense that very big difference between the stack sizes and the ranges, that on ace-high boards, even though under the gun is covering, he just has to check a lot more. Whereas on the low-card boards, he can just bet significantly larger amounts and even jump because he has all the low-suited stuff. So regardless of who covers whom, how the range is constructed is going to be the main deciding factor for the betting frequencies. And with that, we can wrap this chapter up.